They say you never know the worth of something until it's gone. Well, in my case, you never know the stench until someone steals it. One summer morning, I walked out to the edge of my ranch and found my water tank missing 40 years old, bolted into concrete, and gone as if it had sprouted legs. Later that afternoon, I learned where it went. The HOA president, Karen, had paraded it into her neighborhood, bragging about how she had rescued the community from a drought by seizing my precious water supply. What she didn't realize, not for a single smug second, was that the tank wasn't holding water at all. It was my sewage reservoir, an oversized container of waste I'd been cycling out of the ranch for months. By the time she discovered the truth, the damage had already spread through her kingdom. And believe me, the fallout smelled worse than anything you could imagine. My name's Jack Turner. I'm 53 years old, and I've spent nearly every day of my life working land that most folks around here wouldn't touch. While the city sprawls out with its HOA-governed subdivisions, I've kept my place a modest but proud ranch running steady on the other side of the county line. Out here, the air smells of hay and manure. The mornings start with the sound of cattle lowing for feed, and the horizon glows orange when the sun lifts itself over the tree line. My hands are calloused, my back is stiff, but I wouldn't trade this life for anything. I raise cattle, mend fences, and keep the soil turned over for hay and feed. Ranching isn't glamorous, but it's honest. When you live off the land, you come to value practical things: a sturdy pair of boots, a good dog, and water. Water is life here, and I've always managed my own rain catchment wells, and yes, that old tank Karen would eventually make off with. It wasn't pretty, but it did its job storing the runoff, and more importantly, the sewage that had to be separated from the rest of the ranch's water system. Now, just a mile or so from my place, things look a little different. Neatly trimmed lawns, two-story homes with plastic siding painted in shades with names like sandstone beige and colonial gray. And of course, the ever-present HOA rules, taped to bulletin boards or slipped into mailboxes like church flyers. It's a world obsessed with appearance. Grass cut to exactly 3 inches fences, no taller than 4 feet basketball hoops, forbidden mailboxes, painted only in approved shades of black. At the center of all this stands Karen Whitfield, the self-appointed queen bee of the community. She's in her late 40s with a sharp bob haircut and a sharper tongue. I've watched her storm around HOA meetings with a binder under one arm and a finger wagging at anyone who dared question her. To Karen, rules aren't guidelines, they're weapons. She polices garbage cans left out too long, fines people for holiday lights left up past January, and I kid you not, once demanded a neighbor repaint his garage door because the beige was a shade too warm. What made me her target, I couldn't say for sure in the beginning. Maybe it was my proximity. My ranch sat close enough to her development that she could see the edge of my property when she drove past the cattle grazing behind barbed wire instead of neatly trimmed hedges. Maybe it was the water tank itself, a dented relic I'd had for years looming over the pasture like some rusted sentinel. To me, it was utility. To her, it was an eyesore. And Karen despised eyesores the way ranchers despise coyotes near a chicken coop. The funny thing is, I never thought I'd cross paths with her at all. I kept to myself, stayed out of HOA politics, and figured the folks who lived there signed up for that life willingly. If they wanted to pay monthly dues just to get fined for the color of their shutters, that was their business. My ranch was outside HOA jurisdiction, and I intended to keep it that way. But Karen had other ideas. Looking back now, I can see the signs. The first time she drove past my place, I noticed how she slowed down her eyes, locked on my land like a hawk spotting prey. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stared, lips pursed, as though the mere existence of my property offended her sensibilities. I brushed it off until I heard from a neighbor that she'd been talking about me at HOA meetings. "That rancher is wasting resources," she reportedly said. "He's hoarding water during a drought." The irony was rich. My tank didn't contain water at all. It was sewage, processed, recycled, and stored. But Karen didn't know that. She just saw a big ugly container and decided it must hold something she wanted. Before long, I started receiving letters. Not official letters from the county, mind you. These were HOA memos, complete with her signature at the bottom, demanding that I rectify the visual blight of my tank. I crumpled them up and tossed them into the trash. After all, what authority did she have over me? None. At least that's what I thought then. I'd built my life on the principle of minding my own business. The ranch was my sanctuary, a place where I could sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, listen to the cicadas hum at dusk, and watch the stars fill the sky without the glow of suburban streetlights. I didn't ask for trouble. I didn't meddle in other people's affairs, but trouble, in the form of one relentless HOA president, had decided to come knocking anyway. And as I'd soon learn, Karen wasn't the kind of woman who accepted no as an answer. She was the kind who mistook patience for weakness and stubbornness for an invitation to escalate. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. The real trouble started one sweltering July afternoon, the kind of day when the sun bakes the dirt so hard it cracks like pottery, and the cattle crowd together under the shade of the few trees I've got scattered around the pasture. I was fixing a length of fencing near the road when I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching gravel. Karen's silver SUV crept to a stop, and out she came marching across my property line, without so much as a hello. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched high on her nose, she looked like a traffic cop who'd just spotted a broken taillight. "Mr. Turner," she began, her voice clipped and sharp, "we need to have a serious talk about that tank of yours." I leaned against the fence post, wiping sweat from my brow. "That's so funny, I don't recall joining your homeowners club." Her lips tightened. "This isn't about jurisdiction. It's about responsibility. There's a drought. Our community is suffering. Lawns are drying up, children can't run their sprinklers, and yet you're sitting on thousands of gallons of water, hoarding it." I couldn't help but laugh. "Karen, that tank doesn't hold water." But she waved her hand dismissively as if swatting a fly. "Don't insult my intelligence. I've seen the condensation. I know what's inside. And as president of the HOA, I can't just ignore such blatant selfishness." "Again," I said slowly, like I was talking to a stubborn mule, "I don't live under the HOA, and that tank is none of your concern." Her eyes narrowed. "If you refuse to share, don't be surprised if we're forced to take action." That was my first real glimpse of just how far she was willing to go. Most people, you tell them something's not theirs, they back off. Karen, though, you could see the wheels turning in her head, already plotting her next move. A few days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. This one wasn't signed Karen Whitfield, HOA president. No, this time she'd gotten creative. The envelope bore an official-looking stamp, though. When I examined it closer, I realized it wasn't from any county office I'd ever dealt with. Inside the letter demanded I release the water resources of my tank for community relief purposes. It was laughable, but I also knew better than to toss it without a thought. Karen had escalated from idle threats to outright fabrication. I kept the letter, sliding it into a folder in my desk. Something told me it might come in handy later. The rumors started soon after. I heard from a buddy who lived just inside the HOA neighborhood that Karen had been spreading word that I was a miser hoarding clean water while kids in her community went thirsty. She painted me as some greedy rancher who valued profit over people. Never mind that my so-called clean water was anything but. One evening, as I was feeding the cattle, a man I didn't recognize pulled up on the edge of my property. He rolled down his window and shouted, "Hey, why don't you stop being selfish and give some of that water to the rest of us?" I set down the feed bucket and walked over, slow and steady. "Sir, you've been misinformed. That tank ain't drinking water. You wouldn't want a drop of what's inside." He frowned. "Karen said, there's your first mistake." I cut him off, believing Karen. He drove off, muttering, but the damage was done. The seed had been planted. The following week, I noticed something that made my blood run hot. On the far side of my fence, just past the property line, there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, big ones, like from a flatbed truck. Someone had been sniffing around. I checked the padlock on the tank's hatch, still intact. But for how long? That evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip low, I thought about how fast things had escalated. What started as an irritating conversation had turned into rumors, forged letters, and now what looked like reconnaissance missions. Karen wasn't going to let this go. The thing is, part of me wanted to storm over to her precious HOA meeting, slap that letter on the table, and call her out right then and there. But another part of me, the wiser part, told me to sit tight. Let her push harder. Let her make the next move. Because the higher she climbed up her own ladder of arrogance, the further she'd have to fall. Sure enough, the very next day, I got a phone call. No hello, no small talk. Just Karen's voice, sharp as a whip. "Mr. Turner, I'm giving you one last chance. Either you open that tank and share with the community, or I'll be forced to escalate this matter beyond your control." I chuckled into the receiver. "Karen, if you want what's in that tank so badly, be my guest. But don't say I didn't warn you." She hung up without another word. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. She was going to try something bold, something reckless. And as much as I dreaded the headache it would cause, I almost looked forward to it. Because I knew better than she ever could that the outcome wouldn't be what she expected. The spark had been struck. The fire was coming. If you've ever dealt with someone like Karen, you know the pattern. First comes the polite suggestion, then the thinly veiled threat. After that, all hell breaks loose. The week after her phone call, things started happening in rapid succession. I woke up one morning to find a neatly folded envelope taped to my gate. Inside was a notice of violation, citing me for failure to maintain community water standards. It was stamped with the HOA's letterhead, bold and official-looking, though it had no legal weight. At the bottom, in neat cursive, was Karen's signature. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so persistent. I tossed it in the same folder where I kept the other nonsense she'd sent me, but I knew she wasn't stopping there. Sure enough, that same afternoon, my phone lit up with calls from county officials. Not one, not two, but 3 separate departments: environmental resources, zoning, and even public health. Each of them told me they'd received complaints about illegal water storage on my property. I didn't need a crystal ball to guess who made those calls. I spent hours walking county reps around the tank, explaining the whole setup, showing them permits that had been valid for decades. To their credit, most of them shook their heads, muttered about wasting taxpayer time, and left. But the fact that I had to defend myself at all told me exactly how far Karen was willing to go. It didn't stop there. One evening, as I was feeding my cattle, I noticed 2 HOA board members loitering by the road cell phones out snapping pictures of my land. When I approached, they scurried off like raccoons caught in a trash can. Later that week, I saw those same photos printed in the HOA's monthly newsletter, complete with captions about how I was stockpiling resources during a declared drought. Karen was building a case. Not a legal one, because legally she had no ground to stand on, but a social one. She wanted the court of public opinion on her side. She wanted to rally her little kingdom into believing I was the villain, the selfish rancher hoarding life-saving water. What she didn't realize, of course, was that the more she whipped people into a frenzy, the closer she was pushing them toward a disaster none of them could even imagine. The nastiness grew bolder. A neighbor of mine, an older gentleman named Frank, came by one morning looking uneasy. "Jack," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "Karen's been telling folks you're making a fortune selling water out of that tank. Says you're lining your pockets while kids can't even run their sprinklers." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. "Frank, if you think anyone would pay me for what's in that tank, you're sorely mistaken. They'd pay me to stay away from it." He chuckled nervously but looked troubled. "Just keep your eyes open. People are starting to believe her." And he was right. It wasn't long before I found graffiti scrawled on my fence, "Water Thief." Someone even lobbed a half-empty soda can at my truck as I pulled into town for supplies. That's how deep Karen's poison ran. Now, if you know me, you know I'm not quick to anger. My daddy always said a rancher's temper should be like his whiskey, aged and measured, not poured out all at once. But even I have limits, and Karen was pushing me closer to them every day. Then came the night visit. I'd been asleep maybe an hour when my dog Duke started barking his head off. I grabbed my flashlight and shotgun, stepped out onto the porch and spotted movement by the tank, shadows slipping in the dark. By the time I got close enough to shine my light, I saw 2 men fiddling with the padlock. HOA volunteers, no doubt. "Evening, gentlemen," I called out. My voice carried like a whip crack across the pasture. Looking for something. They froze wide-eyed before bolting toward their truck. The engine roared and gravel sprayed as they peeled off into the night. I walked over, checked the lock, scratched, but still holding. I patted Duke's head, muttering, "Good boy." But inside I was seething. Karen wasn't just stirring up gossip anymore. She was trespassing, sending lackeys to do her dirty work. The next morning, sure enough, I found another letter in my mailbox. This one was smugger than the rest. "Mr. Turner," it read, "your refusal to cooperate has left us no choice. The HOA board has unanimously voted to secure your water tank for the benefit of the community. Arrangements are being made. Sincerely, President Karen Whitfield." I read it twice, then a third time, shaking my head in disbelief. She actually believed she had the authority to seize property outside her jurisdiction. It was insanity. But it was also reckless enough that I knew she'd try. I folded the letter neatly, slid it into my growing stack of evidence, and poured myself a stiff drink. The storm wasn't coming, it was already here. From that moment on, I stopped wondering if Karen would make her move. I started wondering when. And I knew that when she did, it would be spectacular. Because here's the thing about people like Karen, they're so blinded by their own arrogance that they never stop to question whether they're marching into a trap. And me, I was more than happy to let her walk straight into mine. I've always believed that no matter how loud or powerful a person seems, they all have a crack somewhere in their armor. With Karen, that crack wasn't hard to find. All it took was paying attention. See, Karen loved an audience. She thrived on being the center of attention, standing up at her HOA meetings like a general addressing her troops. I started making it a point to listen, when neighbors who lived under her rule came by to talk. They were tired of her, worn thin by the endless rules and the constant fines. But they were also scared of her. Karen ruled with intimidation. The moment anyone pushed back, she'd threaten violations, late fees, and even lawsuits. But what they all agreed on, what they laughed about behind her back, was how reckless she was. Karen never checks the facts, one of them told me. She just wants to look like she's in control. If it makes her look good, she'll announce it before she even knows what she's talking about. And that right there was her weakness. Vanity, pride. The desperate need to look like a savior in front of her little kingdom. That weakness showed itself plain as day one, Saturday morning. I drove into town for supplies and stopped by the diner for breakfast. Sitting in a booth near the window, I overheard two HOA members chatting over coffee. "Did you hear?" one of them whispered. "Karen says she's going to secure that rancher's tank by the end of the month. Says it's filled to the brim with fresh water. She even bragged about how she'll finally solve the community's water crisis." I almost laughed out loud into my eggs and bacon. There it was. The plan was no longer just talk, she'd made promises. She'd tied her reputation to the lie that my tank was a fountain of clean water. On the drive back home, I couldn't help but shake my head. Karen was about to march herself into the biggest embarrassment of her life. And I was going to let her. That evening, I took a slow walk around the tank, flashlight in hand. The old thing stood like a rusted giant at the edge of my property, the padlock still strong, the hatch still sealed tight. Inside, the contents sat just as they had for months, thick, foul, and absolutely not what Karen thought. I leaned against the steel, grinning in the dark. "Go ahead, Karen," I muttered. "Make your move." But I wasn't stupid either. If I wanted to protect myself and make sure this played out the right way, I needed proof. So I started preparing. First, I installed a trail camera on a fence post nearby, angled perfectly at the tank. It blended in well enough that no one would spot it unless they knew to look. That way, if anyone tampered with it or worse tried to haul it away, I'd have the evidence on video. Second, I began documenting everything. Every forged letter, every rumor, every time her people trespassed. I snapped photos, logged dates and times, and made sure everything was in order. The folder in my desk drawer was turning into a thick dossier, a record of Karen's madness. And third, I reached out to a friend of mine who worked with the county health department. Without naming names, I asked what the consequences would be if someone were to, say, distribute untreated sewage around a residential area. His face went pale. "That's a serious violation," he said. "Public health hazard, huge fines, possible criminal charges." I just nodded, tucking that little nugget away for later. Meanwhile, Karen's arrogance only grew. She started giving speeches at HOA meetings about her upcoming victory. I wasn't there in person, but recordings made their way to me. She stood at the podium, chin high, proclaiming, "By this time next month, our community will no longer suffer water shortages. I have secured resources that selfish outsiders tried to hoard for themselves." The room erupted in applause. People clapped, cheered, even stood. It was exactly the validation she craved, and it blinded her completely to the truth. I let it all unfold, patient as a cat watching a mouse walk straight into a trap. Because here's the thing, sometimes the best way to deal with bullies isn't to fight them head on. Sometimes you just stand back, let them puff themselves up, and wait for the moment they trip over their own ego. And Karen was tripping faster than I could have imagined. About a week later, I caught sight of her SUV parked just down the road from my ranch. She was standing outside it, phone in hand, snapping photos of the tank like she was surveying her next prize. I could see her grin, even from a distance. That night I jotted down in my notes, "She doesn't know. She has no idea what's inside. She's blinded by the illusion of power." For the first time since this nonsense began, I felt a strange sense of calm. Let her take it, I thought. Let her haul that monstrosity right into her neighborhood. Let her pump it into their sprinklers and fountains. And when the truth comes rushing out, it won't be me who pays the price. No, it'll be her. The beauty of it all, she'd do it to herself. And so, I waited. Patient, steady, just like my daddy taught me. Because the downfall of someone like Karen doesn't come with fists or shouting. It comes with silence, with letting their own arrogance dig the hole they'll eventually fall into. And Karen's shovel was moving faster every day. If part 5 was me quietly studying Karen's weaknesses, part 6 was when she came at me with everything she had. She'd grown too drunk on her own confidence, and when someone like that thinks they've already won, they start swinging wild. It started with noise, literal noise. One Tuesday evening, just after sunset, I heard a convoy of trucks and cars roaring up the road toward my ranch. Dust clouds rose behind their tires, and in the lead was Karen's silver SUV headlights blazing like a chariot announcing war. Behind her, a flatbed truck rattled along, the kind you'd use for hauling heavy equipment. I walked out onto the porch with Duke at my side, shotgun, resting against the doorframe, though I didn't point it at anyone. The convoy rolled to a stop at my gate, and out stepped Karen in her pressed blazer and pencil skirt, clipboard clutched under one arm like she was about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. "Mr. Turner," she shouted, her voice carrying across the pasture. "By unanimous vote of the HOA board, we are here to seize your water tank for the good of the community." I almost choked laughing. "You're trespassing," I called back. "That tank isn't yours. This is private property. You're digging yourself a hole you can't climb out of," she sneered. "We'll see about that. Step aside or I'll have you reported for obstruction." Behind her, a few men, HOA volunteers, or maybe hired hands, climbed out of the truck and started fumbling with the gate. Duke barked and growled, teeth flashing, and they hesitated. I crossed my arms. "Go ahead. Break that lock. But you'd better hope you know what you're stealing." Karen didn't flinch. She just gave a dramatic wave of her hand. "Proceed," and so they did. The men cut the chain, backed the flatbed right up to the tank, and spent the next 2 hours straining and sweating under floodlights, winching that rusted behemoth onto the trailer. I leaned on my porch rail the whole time, watching like it was the most entertaining show on television. When they finally drove off, Karen stood tall in the passenger seat of her SUV, waving triumphantly like a queen returning from conquest. She probably thought she'd just cemented her legacy as the savior of the subdivision. What she didn't realize was that she'd just stolen a ticking time bomb. The next day, I started hearing stories. A buddy of mine who worked as a landscaper in her neighborhood told me Karen had staged a full presentation. She'd set the tank in a communal lot, decorated it with banners that read HOA Water Reserve, and announced over a loudspeaker that the drought crisis was officially over. She was grinning ear to ear, my buddy said, like she'd just won the lottery. But even in her victory lap, Karen wasn't done coming after me. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside were printed copies of formal complaints she'd filed, with the county accusing me of environmental violations, water hoarding, and even fraud. She demanded my ranch be inspected, fined, and stripped of improper resources. I thumbed through the stack, shaking my head. The audacity was almost impressive. She thought she could bury me in paperwork, drain me in legal fees, and leave me humiliated while she basked in glory. Too bad for her, I'd already documented everything. Every fake letter, every trespass, every rumor, and now I had the ultimate weapon. She had stolen the tank herself on camera, with witnesses parading it through town like a prize. Still, I played it cool. I didn't call the sheriff, not yet. I didn't file my evidence. I wanted her to stew in her so-called victory a little longer. That weekend, things got even wilder. Karen hosted what she called a water celebration day in the HOA park. Families gathered, kids ran around with paper cups, and Karen gave another grand speech about how she had secured a sustainable supply for the community. I wasn't there, but a neighbor showed me video clips. She stood on stage, gesturing dramatically toward the tank like it was some holy relic. The crowd cheered, and then she ordered the volunteers to hook hoses into it. I swear when I saw that video, I nearly fell off my chair laughing. You could see the moment people realized something was wrong. At first, there was confusion, water that wasn't clear, a strange odor wafting through the air. Then came the gagging, the screaming, the stampede of parents, dragging kids away from sprinklers that sprayed foul-smelling sludge across the playground grass. Karen's triumphant smile cracked like porcelain. She clutched the microphone, stammering, insisting it was just residual buildup and easily fixed. But the truth was obvious. The tank she'd stolen wasn't full of life-saving water. It was full of sewage. The footage spread fast. Within hours, it was on social media, neighbors posting videos with captions like "Our HOA president poisoned the park," and "Karen's water supply is human waste." Karen, in her desperation, doubled down. She tried to blame me, claiming I'd sabotaged the tank before she confiscated it. She stormed into a county office, demanding an investigation into my ranch. But the more she flailed, the more ridiculous she looked. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, waiting, watching. I knew the right moment would come. The moment to reveal the folder full of evidence, the recordings, the trail camera footage. The moment to end this saga once and for all. And judging by the growing anger in her community, that moment was closer than ever. By the time Karen's so-called water celebration day collapsed into a sewage-soaked fiasco, I knew the tide was turning. The crowd had gagged and scattered, the grass was ruined, and the once proud HOA board was scrambling like cats in a thunderstorm. But here's the thing about a person like Karen: she doesn't quit. She doubles down, claws out, screeching louder to cover up her own mistakes. So I had to be ready. Not just ready to defend myself, but ready to end this once and for all. The first step was organization. That folder in my desk drawer had grown thick with evidence, forged letters, bogus violations, copies of complaints she'd filed, even screenshots of HOA newsletters smearing my name. Now I laid it all out across my dining table piece by piece, like a detective solving a case. At the center, I placed the crown jewel, the trail camera footage of Karen's crew cutting my lock and hauling the tank away. I couldn't help but grin. "You buried yourself, Karen," I muttered. Next, I started lining up allies. I called Frank, my neighbor, who'd warned me about her gossip early on. He wasn't surprised. "I told you she'd go too far," he said. "Half the neighborhood's fed up with her. They just needed a reason to turn." "Then let's give 'em one," I replied. Frank agreed to testify if needed, confirming he'd seen Karen spread lies about me hoarding water. I made a few more calls quietly, carefully to other folks who'd had run-ins with her. Turns out plenty of people were eager to share their stories once they realized they weren't alone. Then came the legal side. I reached out to a lawyer I'd worked with years ago when setting up water rights for my ranch. He was a sharp man named Patterson, gray-haired but quick as a whip. I brought him the folder, explained everything, and sat back as he leafed through the stack with raised eyebrows. "She stole your property, paraded it through town, and distributed untreated sewage to families," he said, half in disbelief. On camera, I confirmed. He tapped the footage with his pen. "That's theft, trespassing, defamation, and a public health violation all rolled into one. She's exposed herself to civil and possibly even criminal charges. Jack, you've got her cornered." I smiled. "Good. I want this airtight. No wiggle room for her to slither out." While Patterson prepared the legal paperwork, I made another strategic move, calling the county health department. Remember that little chat I'd had weeks earlier? Well, now I had names, dates, and video. I asked them to review the footage, and when they saw what Karen had done, hoses, pumping sewage into sprinklers at a children's park, they turned as pale as chalk. "This is a major violation," the inspector said. "We'll have to issue citations, fines, maybe even temporary closure of that park." "Who authorized this?" I leaned back in my chair. "The HOA president. Name's Karen Whitfield." Their pens flew across forms faster than I could blink. By now I had the law on my side, the county on my side, and more than a few neighbors ready to speak up. But the final step wasn't just about paperwork. It was about timing. See, Karen's pride was her downfall. Even after sewage sprayed across the playground, she tried to spin it as my fault. She went door to door telling families I'd poisoned the tank before she confiscated it. She even scheduled a special HOA meeting to reveal her evidence. That was the opening I'd been waiting for. I told Patterson, "We're not just filing this in court, we're going to drop it right on her stage." He grinned. "You're going for the kill shot." "Damn right," I said. In the days leading up to the meeting, I kept quiet. Let her strut. Let her prepare her little speech. I wanted her so confident, so blinded by her ego, that when the hammer dropped, it would shake the whole neighborhood. At night, I'd sit on my porch with Duke curled at my feet, sipping coffee, watching the tank-shaped gap on my property where the drama had begun. The cicadas hummed, the cattle settled, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Not because the battle was over, but because I knew the ending. I'd set the stage. Karen had written the script herself. All I had to do now was wait for her to walk into the spotlight. And when she did, I'd be ready to end her reign once and for all. The night of the big HOA meeting arrived like a storm rolling across the plains. You could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Karen had plastered the neighborhood with flyers, promising to expose the rancher's lies and reveal the truth about the stolen water tank. She wanted a spectacle, and that was exactly what she was going to get, just not the kind she imagined. I showed up early, folder tucked under my arm, Patterson by my side. The community center was already buzzing when we walked in, neighbors clustered in groups, whispering, their eyes darting toward me. Some glared, others looked curious, and a few gave me nods of quiet support. The tank fiasco had rattled them, and they were hungry for answers. At the front of the room, Karen stood like a queen behind her podium, dressed in her finest blazer pearls around her neck, hair perfectly sprayed into place. When she spotted me, her smile tightened. "Mr. Turner," she said into the microphone, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "so glad you decided to join us tonight. I trust you're ready to take responsibility for your actions." I just smiled and took a seat in the front row. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Karen." The meeting began with the usual HOA formalities, minutes from the last meeting, budget reports, all of it a thin prelude to the drama everyone had come to see. Then Karen cleared her throat, straightened her papers, and launched into her performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "as you all know, our community has been facing a severe water shortage. But thanks to decisive leadership, I was able to secure a vital resource. Unfortunately, that resource was sabotaged by an individual who put your families at risk. That man she jabbed her finger at me is Jack Turner, our so-called neighbor. Gasps rippled through the room. She held up a printed photo of my tank, declaring he filled this with waste deliberately to humiliate us. He endangered your children, your homes, your health. The crowd murmured anger and confusion mingling like smoke. Some nodded, others frowned. Karen's voice rose, trembling with righteous indignation. But fear not. I have reported him to county authorities and justice will be served. She paused, waiting for applause. What she got instead was silence. That's when I stood. Slowly, deliberately, I walked to the front, my folder under my arm. Patterson followed, his briefcase in hand. Karen's eyes widened, but she tried to keep her composure. Karen, I said calmly, my voice carrying without a microphone, you're right about one thing. Justice will be served. But not the way you think. I opened the folder and laid the first document on the table, a copy of her forged violation notice. Here's a letter you sent me pretending to represent county authorities. Gasps filled the room. I placed the second document. Here are the baseless complaints you filed, all of which were dismissed. Another ripple of murmurs. Then I pulled out the flash drive and handed it to Patterson, who connected it to the projector. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage from my trail camera. The crowd leaned forward as the video played Karen's volunteers, cutting my lock, straining to haul the tank onto their flatbed, Karen herself waving like royalty as they drove away. The room erupted, shouts, gasps, whispers. Karen's face drained of color. And here, I continued, is footage of what happened next. Patterson clicked, and another clip rolled across the screen, cell phone video of the water celebration day. Kids running through sprinklers, parents gagging, the unmistakable stench, spreading as people realized what was in the tank. Karen standing on stage, desperately insisting it was just residue. The crowd broke into chaos. People shouted, some stood to leave, others turned on Karen with fury in their eyes. I let the noise settle for a moment before speaking again. Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't sabotage anything. That tank never held drinking water. It was sewage, always had been. And Karen stole it, paraded it through your neighborhood, and poisoned your park with it. All because she couldn't stand the idea of not being in control. Karen's voice cracked as she grabbed the mic. Lies, he doctored that footage. He's framing me. But Patterson stepped forward, voice steady as a judge. For the record, my client has already submitted this evidence to county officials and the health department. Charges are being considered. Civil damages are inevitable. And if you doubt it, you'll see the subpoenas yourselves soon enough. Silence fell like a hammer. You could hear a pin drop until one of the board members stood and said, Karen, you told us it was safe. You told us he was the villain. Another voice shouted from the back. My kid was sick for 2 days because of that stunt. And then the dam burst. People swarmed her with questions, accusations, demands for resignation. Karen stammered, waving her hands, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But her kingdom had turned on her. The board called for an emergency vote right then and there. Within minutes, the motion passed. Karen was removed as president of the HOA. She stood frozen, her face twisted with disbelief. Her power, her reputation, her carefully cultivated empire, it was all gone in a single night. I turned to leave, pausing just long enough to look her in the eye. Next time, Karen, maybe check what you're stealing before you brag about it. And with that, I walked out into the cool night air, Duke, waiting faithfully in my truck. The war was over, and the Queen had fallen. The morning after that fateful meeting, I woke to a silence I hadn't felt in months. No cars idling at my gate, no envelopes taped to my fence, no neighbors glaring from across the road, just the sound of roosters crowing and the steady rhythm of cattle moving through the pasture. It felt like peace had finally returned to the ranch. Word traveled fast. By noon, I'd heard from 3 different folks in the HOA, each one apologizing in their own way. We didn't know, one man said over the phone, his voice low with embarrassment. We just believed what Karen told us. We should have questioned it. Another neighbor stopped by in person with a pie his wife had baked, a kind of old-fashioned peace offering. For what it's worth, he said, we're glad the truth came out. I accepted their words not out of spite, but out of understanding. People get swept up in mob, thinking when someone loud and confident leads the charge. Karen had been that voice, shrill, commanding, relentless. Without her, the HOA seemed suddenly leaderless, scattered, even humbled. As for Karen herself, she all but vanished. Rumor had it she'd been slapped with heavy fines from the health department, and lawsuits were already circling. Parents who'd had kids sick after the sewage spray were talking about suing the board. Even her closest allies on the HOA had turned their backs on her, eager to distance themselves from the disaster. Where once she strutted through the neighborhood, now her blinds stayed shut and her driveway sat empty. The queen had lost her crown, and the kingdom wasn't eager to forgive. Meanwhile, life on the ranch went on. I patched fences, tended to the herd, and finally replaced the old tank with a newer, more discreet system tucked away behind the barn. Every time I saw that empty patch of dirt where the rusted giant had once stood, I chuckled. Who would have thought a sewage tank could spark such chaos? Looking back, it wasn't the tank itself that mattered. It was what it represented: independence. I'd chosen a life outside the tight grip of HOA rules, free from arbitrary fines and power-hungry presidents. Karen couldn't stand that. She saw my freedom as a threat to her authority, and in trying to take it from me, she ended up destroying herself. One evening, Frank joined me on the porch, sipping a beer as the sky turned shades of red and gold. He shook his head slowly. "You know, Jack, I've lived under that HOA for 10 years. Paid my dues, trimmed my hedges, followed every silly rule. And I can tell you what you did standing up to her like that. Folks won't forget it." I shrugged. I didn't do much. Just stayed out of her way and let her trip over her own ego. Frank chuckled. "Sometimes that's the smartest fight, to pick the one you don't have to swing a single punch in." We clinked bottles and watched the cattle settle in for the night. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at ease. Justice doesn't always come quick. Sometimes it creeps along slow like a wagon in the mud. But when it arrives, it hits hard and leaves a mark. Karen had stolen a sewage tank thinking it was treasure. In the end, all she held in her hands was the mess she created. And me, I got my peace back. If there's one thing I learned from this mess, it's that arrogance has a way of destroying itself. People who crave control, who twist the truth to suit their own power, can only carry that axe so far before the mask slips. The key is patience, standing firm, documenting the truth, and waiting for the moment when lies collapse under their own weight. To anyone watching this, remember, you don't always have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes the most powerful move is to stay steady, let the other side burn out, and reveal themselves for who they are. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, or a Karen who thought she ran the world? Share your story in the comments below. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. There are plenty more stories to tell.